All right, welcome back to the channel. All right, in this video, we're going to do a deep dive into all things gesture drawing. It's going to be a little bit longer than normal, so feel free to use the timestamp below and pick and choose what parts you specifically want to dive into and get to take a closer look at. All right, let's get to it. Okay, so the first question is, what are gesture drawing, essentially? Well, it's good to think of it this way. It's essentially a visual shorthand to capture the movement, motion, or overall flow of the character. Like if you watched my previous video, link here, we talked about one of the essential elements for good gesture drawing is the line of action. And so that line of action, again, is a summarization of the entire flow of the figure in one single line. After we've established that line of action, we can then build our gesture on top of that. And you'll notice oftentimes, and maybe you're impressed by this or surprised by this, but gesture drawings can be done 1, 2, 3 minutes. It doesn't really matter the time frame. It's just it can be done pretty quickly. Well, why is that? Like, what is the point of gesture drawing? Well, look at it this way. If we look at drawing a figure in stages, gesture drawing is really the first stage. Your initial goal is to capture the overall impact of the character, right? If they're doing some dynamic movement, you want to capture that motion or movement. You want that part to be as fluid and as clear as possible. You know, what is the motion that the person going? What is their gesture essentially? What is the impact, the impression they're making on you as the viewer? Additional stages may involve when you actually start to add more volume to your character. Now that would involve, maybe you've seen the mannequin method. You see, in the mannequin method, you're using shapes to represent different aspects of the figure in space. And so that's where you start to add, more of a spatial reality to your figure. Then the next stage would be perhaps going in and start to think about the contour, this actual figure you're looking at, what are some of the nuances of it? And you start adding details. So we approach figure drawing or life drawing in layers. Just like in Photoshop, you have various layers, layer 1, 2, 3, that each layer is built upon the previous one. So gesture drawing is really our first stage, our layer 1, essentially. You want to do your gesture drawings in a way that you can build upon later on. Now, gesture drawings in themselves are just a beautiful exercise in simplification, in capturing movement and motion, right? And so I want to take you through this. This is, what's a basic workflow? Different artists have different approaches. That goes without saying, honestly. If you're on YouTube at all, you've seen a bunch of different approaches, I'm sure, to gesture drawing. One of my favorites is Michael Hampton, phenomenal, amazing teacher, illustrator. He has a very structural approach. So he literally has like, I think 4 or 5 stages, the head, the neck region, the thoracic region, the lumbar, like he has it literally listed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the process he goes through. I'm not Michael Hampton, obviously. And so each artist has kind of developed what works for you. Like for you, what is your best workflow or approach to your gesture drawing? So I want to demonstrate to you my basic workflow, how I approach it. And then as you see, you can, if you like some of the points that I make, like some of my approach, feel free to incorporate that into your own gesture drawing. Like any artist, we're all still evolving as artists. So as we look at different, artists, how they approach things, we kind of pick and choose elements we like, and then we can incorporate that into our workflow as well. So one thing you may have noticed is timed gesture drawings. You may ask yourself, what is the point of timing myself when I'm trying to draw something? Well, I mentioned this in my previous video, but essentially you're eliminating or limiting your time to overthink the drawing. So you have more of I want to call it maybe a visceral reaction to the image, and you want to capture that flow and that energy as quickly as possible, in an authentic way as possible. And so you're not spending a lot of time trying to meticulously draw, the circle here, the circle there, Instead, you've established a visual shorthand to represent different aspects of the figure. I'm going to take you through again my process and kind of how I visually notate elements of the figure, things to keep in mind, so it makes gesture drawing that much easier. So when it comes to the figure, I'll demonstrate here. We have, like I said in my previous video, essentially the first step for me will always be the line of action. And it's easy to see the line of action, or much easier to see the line of action when you're drawing a dynamic pose, right? So, for instance, I'm going to pull up one of these images. Okay, so here we have a ballerina, right? Now, if I'm looking at what her line of action would be in this particular pose, we're always looking again for S curves or C curves. C curves or S curves when it comes to drawing the figure, or capturing that first line of action. So when I'm looking at this figure, I'm going to do something like this, and probably an arrow here. You see, when you initially look at it, the idea is, okay, what can I capture the overall thrust or flow of the motion? That's going to be my initial line of action there, something along those lines, right? I want to say there's no right or wrong way to do it in terms of each artist, as they're trying to capture the line of action, may approach it differently. This is just my personal approach, and even in this, I may change it up a little bit and think, okay, there's a thrust coming here, and then kind of a quick shift. And see, that will help me. Seeing that change in trajectory will help me, because later on when I'm doing the gesture, I'm going to make sure that this part of the torso, there's an abrupt change between that and the hip region. So that change, that adjustment in the trajectory, kind of it highlights the dynamic nature of the figure in this particular pose. So another example, we want to look at a more stationary pose, right? Again, the question comes up, well, if a person's in motion, it's easy to see that S curve or that C curve. But if they're basically stationary, how do you establish or recognize, where's the flow for this figure? The best way to start is to look for the weight-bearing leg. So in this figure, where is the weight shifted to? Well, clearly, it's going to be on his right leg. So when I see that, now I can say, okay, if the weight is there, the line of action typically kind of flows through that leg and up through the body. So it'll be something like this. Maybe not exactly, something along those lines. There's going to be that flow, as if the energy comes from where the weight is beared down and then flows up through the body. That's how I'm going to visually look at this figure. And so if I'm doing a gesture drawing based on this guy, I may or may not make a line here at the bottom, and then I'm going to, sorry, that's not the best one, something like that. So it's a basic S curve. And then on top of that, I'm going to start building my gesture drawing. So now I want to take you through a basic approach to gesture drawing. So how do we build our gesture on top of the line of action? So again, let's start here, the line of action. Something like that, right? So on a different layer in Photoshop, I'm using Photoshop, by the way, so this is a digital drawing. What am I looking for first when it comes to the gesture drawing? Typically, my step one is to look at the angles. By that, I mean the tilt of the shoulder and the tilt of the hips. What angles are they at? So when I'm looking at this figure, again, his hips are tilted this way, and his shoulders, there's a little bit of foreshortening because he's tilted. His right shoulder is coming towards us a little bit more. And so it's kind of like, I would exaggerate this a little bit. So this is the angle I'm going to push. When you look at him and think, oh, but it's going down as well. If it was completely front facing without any type of a tilt to it, you would be able to see a little bit more. But because the hips are angled up one way, that generally means that because the body, there's something called contrapposto. So there's counterbalance, which means the figure is always trying to maintain balance. If the weight is bearing down here, it goes up through this area, through the hip. And so that's going to be where the hip is tilted up slightly. That's going to mean that the shoulders are going in the opposite direction to a degree. So we're not overly exaggerating it, but there's going to be that slight shift as one tilts, the other tilts in the opposite direction. That's a good rule of thumb to follow. Wherever the weight bearing leg is, that hip is going to be a little bit higher than the other hip. That's going to mean the opposite is taking place with the shoulders. When you're doing your gesture drawing, you're trying to capture these various visual cues so that when you draw the figure, it captures the same motion, the same visual motion and fluidity as the figure we're looking at. The first thing I'm going to do is look at the tilt. So here for the hips, we have a tilt going up, and this one we have a slightly going down. Again, typically with men, you're not going to shift their shoulders too much. It's going to stay primarily horizontal, but just a slight shift there. Something like, one more time, something like that. The next thing I'm going to do is, in my workflows, typically I notate the head. And I keep it really simple, just a ball, a basic sphere for the head. From this point, I typically like to go back down and focus on the legs first, and then torso, and then the arms. The arms are last for myself because when you're going through your drawing process, what you want to capture are, I like the Burne Hogarth approach, and he's a old school illustrator, amazing artist who teaches us how to draw. He focuses on drawing the figure from imagination. What he likes to focus on is which elements of the body have the most impact on the movement of the figure. His basic approach is torso and hips, find the twist there, the angles and the twist. Then focus on the legs because that's going to have a bigger impact on the movement of the figure. Then the arms, and lastly, the head. Because if anything, the head can be in a million different directions no matter what the body is doing. But if the body is stationary in one position with the legs one way, then of course the arms can be in different positions, but the legs are stationary that way. And that's all built upon the hips and the torso. So because we're doing gesture drawing, we're not super focused on the spatial relationships between the torso and the hips yet. That's something we would build on the next stage, right? So here, I keep it very simple. It's just the tilt of the hip, the tilt of the shoulders. Then, like I said, I like to visually notate where the head is placed personally. And then I go in and say, okay, I'm going to draw this first leg. Now, this is where a visual shorthand comes into play. There's a couple of interesting things. Again, Burne Hogarth, I think that's how you pronounce his name. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. He talks about this. When you're drawing the leg basically has two different shapes or two different visual shorthands we can use to keep it really simple. So if you're looking, and the key to that is if you can see both ankles or only one ankle. That may sound strange, but follow me here. If I can see both ankles, which I can see here, left and right, the leg typically takes the shape of a B. So essentially that is the shape. And again, that's exaggerating a little bit more for emphasis, but we're talking about something like that. Then if we only see one ankle, it takes the form of an S curve, right? And it may sound strange, but keeping that principle in mind saves you so much time. Because when you're, again, if you're doing a time drawing, a gesture drawing, you're trying to capture the energy of the figure, right? So as you're looking at the figure, all you have to do now is look at the legs, look at the ankles. Do you see both ankles or just one ankle in that leg? So let's demonstrate. In this case, I'm going to do a sweeping motion. Sorry, that kind of goes in. Sweeping motion. And then something simple, kind of visual representation of where the foot would be. Right? Something like that. And then I may draw, the knee here. I don't have to, but something like that. That's how I'm going to represent that leg. Now the opposite takes place over here, right? So this leg, I'm going to do basically an S curve here. Try one more time. Something like this, right? Don't like that foot. So an S curve. Then I'm going to notate the foot here. So something along those lines. And again, we can draw the knee here. So that's a rough approximation of how we're going to approach the leg here. Now what I like to do is do the torso. And then the hip region. And now, of course, if I can always go back because you notice, again, here, this becomes more vertical. The line of action a little bit more vertical. Here I messed up a little bit to where it's leaning a little too much. So I could shift this a little bit more. For example, we're going to take this back and shift that way. So we get more of a vertical here. There we go. So now when I draw in the torso, it's aligned a little bit better with our reference image. And then, of course, we have the hips. And you have a couple of approaches you can take. So we have the legs. When it comes to the torso and the hips, when you're doing a gesture drawing, your goal is not necessarily to slow down to the point where you're trying to draw like a box, for example, for the hips, because that is a visual reference or visual representation could be the box, right? Because now you're adding perspective here for your character, and that's going to be helpful. Trust me, when it comes to building out the rest of your more detailed drawing. However, when it comes to the gesture, you're not necessarily slowing down for that. So a sphere is typically good enough, a lightly drawn in sphere, and then because you already have your angle established, which is your line. And then if you want to, you can always add a little bit of an arc here. This all depends on timing. I don't typically slow down for all this, but if you want to, you don't have to. Once you have this established, which is pretty good, now we finally go into the arms. And similar to the legs, there's a visual shorthand I like to. I've looked at. I know Kaysen, I think is his name, on YouTube, and there's a couple of other artists that use visual shorthands for this. So let's take a look back at our reference image for a second. So when you look at the arm, I'll go back for a second. Okay. So when we're drawing the gesture drawing, we want things to flow naturally. So you want to avoid things like, okay, well, we could visually notate this. Okay, that's the joint, another joint, a line here. Hey, that may be how you've seen it. If you've seen a lot of people when they do their gesture drawing, they do a stick figure. There's nothing wrong with that. Just put that out there. There's nothing wrong with that approach. However, it can come across as very stiff. We're trying to use primarily S curves and C curves for all elements of the body, other than the tilt. I'll say this: other than the tilt we established at the beginning, the hip tilt and the shoulder tilt, those I typically use straight lines. But for everything else, we're trying to use some sort of a curve because it gives the figure more of a flow. You're going to be adding elements that make the figure increasingly stiff as you go. So if you start out your gesture drawing too stiff, then there's no hope for it. I mean, as you keep drawing, the character's going to get increasingly stiff, and you may end up with a drawing that just has no life to it. But if when you draw your gesture, you make sure you exaggerate some of those elements, the looseness of the figure, to where you capture that flow. Then as you're adding those other elements, like the various shapes to represent elements of the body, if you're going the mannequin route, now you're taking a very fluid figure and just adding elements to it to make it a more structurally sound. But you'll maintain some of that flow that you already established. So went on a little bit of a tangent there. The point is, you want to use what's called you want to use something that visually kind of ties everything together. And so a good frame of reference is as you're drawing, you want to use curves that flow one into the other as you draw. So if one curve, for example, let's say we're representing the shoulder here, that's going to curve this way. The next curve, and it doesn't have to be a huge C curve, but the next curve would be this way. And then now the next curve would be this way. And then here we would notate kind of where a shift takes place for the wrist. Same thing over here. This would be the shoulder, the next curve, and then the next curve. And then if you want to, a third curve could be this one. And then, notate the hand, for example. So if you just take a look, I wanted to show you, for example. If we just removed you see, we already have a flow to his arms here. And we're only using a few lines to do that. So we're not getting bogged down in, okay, how do I draw the muscle? How do I draw the bicep? How do I draw the forearm muscles? None of that matters during your gesture drawing stage. You're just trying to visually capture the flow of the figure. So again, going back to our drawing, I'm going to probably start with the more straight arm first. That's just my approach. So I'm going to do this, and then this. And then I just draw in where the hand would be, right? And the same thing over here. We have the shoulder, the bicep area. This could be one line that just flows this way, or like I said, we're going to use interchangeable lines. Then I'm going to do something like this. And then his hand is right here. So some of the placement is a little bit off. I'm going to try that one more time because I could have exaggerated. You see how the angle here is? I could have exaggerated that a little bit more. So I'm going to go backwards here. Try that one more time. So we have the shoulder. Again, during our gesture, we want to exaggerate elements of it as much as possible because this allows us then later on to add more structurally sound elements without losing the full gesture. Right? So this is what we have so far. We see the full flow of the figure here. After, and this is basically where you could stop at this stage for your gesture drawing. So in summary, we have 4 stages, I think it is. We have 1 line of action. That, again, is a visual. If we could take everything about this figure, the entire movement, and summarize it in one smooth, flowing line, that's going to be a C curve or an S curve, typically. Never a straight line. Secondly, we establish our tilts. Our tilts. And again, this is kind of, if you want to, these two can kind of go hand in hand. 2, this is number 1. And I say that because when we do our line of action, we also are looking at the weight-bearing leg. So we can visually notate, where is the weight going to be bearing down for this character. Once that's established, we do our line of action. We can also add the arrow in we talked about to know kind of where the flow is going. Then we look at our tilts here. That's stage 2. So stage 3, typically, I focus in on the legs. Three legs. We start with the weight-bearing leg, and then we draw the other leg. And again, as a visual cue, we look at where are the ankles. If we can visually see both ankles, then we're going to approach it with a B shape. If we only see one ankle, it's going to basically be some form of an S curve. The top part of the S basically flows into the knee, and then the bottom part would represent the calf and the bottom part of the leg. And I'm going to show you a few examples of that later on. But that's the basic approach. Then next we go in and we do our torso and hips. And again, with our torso and hips, we've already established the tilt. So that gives us a clue on our perspective, but we're not focused on perspective at this point. We're simply focused in on representing the mass, so that general region for our figure. Lastly, we go in with our arms. And again, with the arms, we want to keep clearly in mind that flow. One thing leads to the next. So instead of doing, ball joint, straight part for the bicep, ball joint, straight part for the forearm area, and then a hand, which again, this can work. Believe me, everyone has a different approach. That can work. If we want our figure to remain fluid and smooth, we're doing one line that leads to the next line, leads to the next line, leads to the next line. Each thing flows, each curve flows into the next one. It's easier to do when you're drawing quickly. It's easier to establish that flow, and it's going to give you a more fluid base, or like layer 1, to build your figure on as you add more structural elements. This is my basic approach to gesture drawing. We have those 5 steps. Line of action, establish the tilt, look at the legs, the torso, and then lastly, the arms. And having some of those key points in mind in terms of having a basic workflow and then the visual shorthand we talked about, having those things in mind will allow you to very quickly capture the figure in motion without overthinking it. The time drawings are a good idea as far as, when you're practicing, to get you used to visually notating the figure and looking at a full, reference image, seeing can I transfer that into my personal visual notation methodology. Now take that, draw it this way, and still capture the basic movement and motion that I'm looking for. Now I want to demonstrate for you something else. So in the previous demonstration, we talked about the leg. If you can see both ankles, you're looking at something along the lines of a B shape. And if you can see only one ankle, you're looking at something along the lines of an S curve. Now, this ballerina is a perfect example of this. So look at this, for example. We only, in both legs, we only see one ankle. So for her, we're looking at something along the lines of this. It's a flowing S curve. Next, again, same thing. It doesn't matter if it's fully bent. S curve. S curve. Okay, here's an example in which we see both. We see one. Here we see both ankles, so we're looking at something along the lines of a B. In this angle, however, we're doing another S. S, S. B, S. S, S, S. B, S. So of course, it's partially open to interpretation, but for the most part, everything falls into one of these two categories. B, S. Now this one's a little bit different because even though in this angle we can see both ankles, I would still suggest, I think just visually it's much easier to just do an S curve as opposed to the B. Again, S, S. So in each case, again, what we're looking at is if we can simplify the figure. Normally we think about simplifying the figure in terms of shapes, but these curves are just as important. And in doing so, we can very quickly capture the flow of the figure. And really, my friends, that is the point of gesture drawing. Can you capture the flow, the movement of the character? There's a lot of different approaches. You may see different people with different, ways to do it online. This is the point, though. Can you capture, visually notate the figure as quickly as possible in a way that captures the right energy? You don't have to do it quickly, honestly. You can do a little bit more of a slow approach. That's fine. But once you've captured the energy of it, the flow of the figure, you can then use that as your base layer, your base level, to then build your figure on top of it. Now I'm going to demonstrate for you the arms. Again, we talked about this. One thing flowing into the next. Again, we have like the shoulder here. So this goes here. Then we have the bicep area. And then we have something like that, right? Again, shoulder flows into this. Arm back here, shoulder. In each case, keep it real simple, but it's a quick visual notation. Another nice one. Another one here. You're thinking, how can I simplify this part and still capture the movement and the motion as quickly and easily as possible? So for example, if now we add a layer, just because I want you to see, if we remove all the details, we're still capturing part of that flow. Now, of course, we don't have the other elements. We don't have the torso. We don't have the hips and everything. But just look at this. You can see the flow of the arms. You can see the flow of the legs here. Same thing here. Arms, legs. Now, if you just added like, the head or the general line of action here, you have a basic figure. Because I'm not looking at reference at this point, but you have a basic figure in each case, and you're not using a lot of lines here. You're keeping it extremely simple at this point. So, for example, say I did want to go in here. There's your elements we're looking at. Now, it's not as complicated as we make it out to be at times. So let's try another figure. Here we have a guy. He has more clothing on, so it may not be quite as easy to spot some of the things, but we're going to go through it anyway. So again, I'm looking at this figure, and I'm thinking, okay, what's the weight bearing leg? That's going to be his right leg. So what's the flow now of energy through his figure? I'll go with this arrow here. So typically, if the person is raising their hand, it's going to go through the hand, or if their head will be the terminating part of this energy flow. So when I'm drawing this figure, I exaggerate just a little bit, something like that. Oh, let's try that one more time. Something like that. Now the next stage, again, we're looking at the angles of the hips and then the angle of the shoulders. Now this shoulder is raised just a little bit because he literally, for example, if you look at my body right now, this is my collarbone. This is going to be the line, essentially. He's literally the hip, sorry, the shoulder and the shoulder can move on its own a little bit. So literally, I'm raising it up and down. That's what you see here. Even though the angle is something along these lines, the shoulder itself is raised a little bit, right? Next stage, we're going to draw. This is going to be an S curve. And then we have more along the lines of a B curve. From here, we have the torso, which is tilted slightly this way, and the hips this way. We can add in an element of the neck, and then we're doing the curves for the body, for the arms. Sorry. And if we look at that, we've essentially captured the basic movement for our character. So let's try it over here. Again, I like to use my blue. So we've already established the line of action. Now I'm taking a look at the angles here and on these lines here. And I'm going to do from this hip down, and then the B curve here. Now, one thing I'm going to add in here is the neck. I didn't really talk about that before. But because of the angle, we can add in the neck here, the torso, slightly tilted this way, the hips, and then both arms. First, this arm, is raised. So we're going to have the shoulder a little bit higher. This elbow even. Curve it back around. The hand. And then the other shoulder, I'll lower this just a little bit. And then something along these lines. And that's essentially it. One additional thing we can add, and this is something that you don't have to do at first, especially in early stages, but if we want to get a sense of perspective, a very simple way to visually notate perspective are arcing lines. So what that means is, let's see, if we had a cylinder, for example, right? If we had a cylinder, for example, and we had look at it straight ahead, we know there's no perspective there. We're looking at it straight ahead. However, if we start to tilt it, right, now we're starting to see, we get a sense of the perspective involved. This is the top, this is the bottom. If we tilt it even more, we start to only see this, and some of it's going to start to recede in space, perhaps. Right, and so the opposite is also true. If now this is rotating this way, a little bit more this way. The opposite is also true. If we start tilting it the opposite direction, like this, now we start to see these are not the best drawn, but you get the point. This starts to recede. This is the same box or the same cylinder, right? But as it tilts a different direction, we see different elements of it. These wrapping lines help to establish what direction it's going in. Well, those same wrapping lines can work on our figure. For example, if I'm looking at this individual, right? Take away that. Go back to our red. So I'm looking at him and I've established, okay, this is here, this is here. But I want to think, okay, now what direction, if this is, where or would the wrapping lines be? So if it's coming out a little bit, wrapping lines would curve this way. And then as this goes down, it's going to curve a little bit this way. Same thing if you're looking at the leg, right? This is going to recede a little bit into space as if this is your tube here or your cylinder, and this is going to be a little bit more even, so to speak. The lines, you may have a few lines here and there, like you have a few lines here, wrapping lines. Same thing here, wrapping lines, wrapping lines. Same thing with your arm. This comes towards us just a little bit in space. The arm goes out a little bit. So same thing for us over here. We're drawing, we don't have to overdo it basically, but you can have wrapping lines that give an implication of what the figure is doing in deep space. Same thing here. And that's going to help you when you are adding more structural elements to your drawing. Right. Thanks so much for joining me for this deep dive into gesture drawing. Again, this is just kind of my particular approach to the subject. So I hope you found some things that were useful to you and that you can incorporate. Feel free to drop a line below of what's your current take on gesture drawing. Like, where are you at right now? What do you want to work on? Any specific questions you may have. In our next video, we're going to do a breakdown between more dynamic poses and then more static poses. Like, what's the approach to each of those? All right, until next time, stay enthusiastically optimistic. This is Steven, signing off.